Welcome to Blind Spot. I'm Steve Reardon. I'm happy to welcome on the podcast today Lanhee Chen. Chen is the David and Diane Steffi Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Director of Domestic Policy Studies, and lecturer in the Public Policy Program at Stanford University. He is also an affiliate at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a counsel at the law firm R& Fox LLP. A veteran of several high-profile political campaigns, Chen served as the policy director for the 2012 Mitt Romney campaign, and most recently, Chen was a senior advisor to Senator Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. Chen earned his Ph.D. and AM in political science from Harvard University, his J.D. cum laude from Harvard University, and his A.B. magna cum laude in government from Harvard College. It's amazing you ended up here.
It is.
Lanhee.
The weather's better here.
So, Lanhee Chen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I guess I want to start off just looking at we just passed the first 100 days of Trump's presidency. There's been a lot of commentary about how he's done, good and bad. Where do you come down on evaluating the first 100 days of this administration?
I think we have to look at it in a more nuanced way. I think it's easy for some of the conservative press to say everything's gone great. It's easy for some of the mainstream media to say, look, everything's been awful. I think the reality is somewhere in between. I think there have been a number, first of all, of significant accomplishments. Clearly, the nomination and confirmation of Neil Gorsuch to the U.S. Supreme Court is huge. It's a 30-year game changer in a lot of ways. The administration's also accomplished quite a bit with respect to streamlining the regulatory and administrative state, which I think for conservatives ends up being a huge policy priority. I think in foreign policy, the administration has struck a much more robust tone. And if you look at the response, for example, to the awful attacks from Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the way in which the U.S. responded, I think, was different, certainly in tone, from what the Obama administration would have done. So I think there are a number of areas where the administration has been quite successful. I think there's been other areas where things have been much more mixed. So, for example, they got health care passed through the House a little bit after the 100-day mark, but that was not without its share of consternation in getting there, and it's unclear what the fate of that bill is going to be going forward. On tax reform, I think they've put forward a very strong footprint, but the progress there has been slow. The so-called travel ban, I think that the first iteration of that was botched horribly. I think they've subsequently recovered. But again, I think, to be clear, I think that the administration has had some successes. But I do think in other areas they're learning, the president in particular is learning, that dealing with politicians in Washington is very different from dealing with people in business. And I think some of those growing pains are showing.
Right. So let's focus on just one of those while you were talking. Obviously, healthcare is a big story at the moment. A reformed version of the ACHA has been passed through the House. What do you think about that bill in its second iteration? This is something you've studied extensively. So where are you on the reform that they're proposing?
I think it's a very good start. I think that, first of all, I was supportive of the House passing the American Health Care Act. I think that it's not perfect, and I think there are a number of ways in which now the process has gone to the Senate. There will be opportunities to improve it. In my view, the biggest strengths of the bill are the fact that it engages in some fundamental entitlement reform, changing the Medicaid program, which is the state federal health care program focused on lower-income Americans, really changing that from the current model, which is largely unsustainable. It's an open-ended entitlement program, to one where the federal contribution is much more delineated and much more predictable over time. I think it also potentially gives states greater flexibility to run programs that are more innovative. So I think that that's a plus. I think another plus is the notion of moving away as much as possible from Obamacare's regulatory strictures, which frankly changed healthcare in the U.S. from a state-based concern to one that was federalized. So
on the Medicare thing, I mean, that is going to make it harder to pass through the Senate, is it not? I mean,
yeah, the Medicaid,
states, right?
the Medicaid reforms. The Medicaid reforms definitely place pressure on some states. And it is the case, particularly that you've got senators that come from states like Ohio, for example, where John Kasich did take the Medicaid expansion. There was an option under Obamacare to expand Medicaid. He took that, and as a result, the changes that passed through the House are going to place more pressure on states like Ohio and California and New Jersey, which opted for the Medicaid expansion. There's no question that the Senate's going to have to go back and revisit, for example, how significantly those changes happen and how quickly they happen. But fundamentally, the idea of reforming entitlement programs, this will be the first time in modern American history that you will see the rollback of an entitlement program, which I think is kind of a big deal. So there are elements here that I think are worth looking at, and the Senate's going to have to make changes. There's no question about it. Some of the subsidies to help lower-income Americans buy private health insurance are frankly not generous enough in the House-passed bill. They're going to have to look at that. They're going to have to look at how they deal with the fact that the House-passed bill could leave some folks uninsured. The Congressional Budget Office said there'd be 24 million more uninsured compared to Obamacare. I question whether the number's actually that big, but there's no question in my mind that they've got to do more to beef up incentives to acquire health insurance. So
bringing up the CBO, that's really interesting because, a lot of the critics of the second iteration of the bill were critical of the fact that it passed the House without getting a new CBO score.
Yeah, I don't think that it I'm not swayed by that argument very much for a few reasons. First of all, the Congressional Budget Office studied the AHCA. Practically the AHCA that was passed was the one they evaluated. Yes, there were changes along the way that you can argue would influence the coverage numbers on the margin, but I'm not compelled by the notion that you had to score the exact bill to see exactly what it was going to do, because here's the thing. The CBO is estimating anyway, and when they estimated Obamacare, for example, they had all sorts of predictions that were way off. So, this is just a red herring in my mind. People are putting it out there to say, well, couldn't they have run a better process? Of course, if they had a process that allowed for more input and was longer, are there advantages to a process like that? Absolutely. That's not the process they used, and I don't think that is a reason to oppose the bill. I think it is a complaint you can have about the process. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I think the bill they got actually does make progress in some really important areas. So I'm not personally convinced that a CBO score of the bill that actually passed would have made a big difference. Mm.
Your third piece on the bill was dealing with pre-existing conditions.
Yeah.
So how do you feel like the bill deals with that?
I actually think the bill does it pretty well. I think the mainstream media and a lot of liberals are convinced the only way to deal with pre-existing conditions is exactly the way Obamacare dealt with them. So the comparison I like to use is that Obamacare decided to solve a problem that could have been solved with a hammer, and instead, they took a huge jackhammer to solve it instead. They used a mechanism that included requirements on insurers and restrictions on the rates they could charge and specific requirements on the benefits that had to be provided in plans. That was the Obamacare approach. And a lot of liberals say, well, that's the only way to deal with pre-existing conditions. First of all, that's absolutely false. Second of all, the way the Republican proposal does it is much more targeted, and I think could potentially be just as, if not more, successful. The key question with the Republican approach, Republicans do have a way of dealing with pre-existing conditions in the bill they pass. They absolutely do. The big question is the funding going to be sufficient to make it work? Now, right now, Republicans have devoted up to $123 billion over 10 years to address the pre-existing condition exclusion problem. Some have argued it needs to be beefed up a little bit more. The Senate can certainly and should look at that. But fundamentally, the proposal Republicans have is to say, look, we want to figure out a way to specifically help those with pre-existing conditions. Separate and apart from putting this gigantic regulatory overlay on the healthcare system. I think that approach is fundamentally the right one, and I applaud Republicans for taking that approach. And frankly, I think shame on progressives who argue the only way to solve this problem is to do it the way Obamacare did. I think that's fundamentally untrue. Mm.
I want to take a step back and just sort of look at the entire healthcare industry as it is. One of the questions about these bills is, do they do enough to actually reform the underlying structure of the healthcare system? The U.S. is the highest healthcare costs in the world, and not necessarily, although a very high quality of healthcare. Do you not think there is something more fundamental and more structural that actually needs to change within the system?
Oh, no question there is. And you raise some excellent observations. The U.S. has the highest per capita healthcare spending of any industrialized country, easily 30 to 40% more than our nearest, I won't call it competitor, but our nearest peer country. And we have a system that is fundamentally opaque in the sense that the consumer has no idea how much his or her healthcare actually costs. So that ends up driving up the cost of healthcare such that we spend about 17, 18% of our economy on healthcare.
And why is that? Is that because of the insurance set up through employers?
Yeah,
is it the second post-World War?
It is primarily because we have a third-party system of payment.
Right.
For most people, you either get a health insurance plan through your employer, or you're on Medicare or Medicaid, which are government programs, and you don't have a sense for how much things cost. And by the way, health insurance in the United States is not really insurance. Insurance is designed to protect against catastrophic events. So if you think about an auto insurance policy, the reason you carry an auto insurance policy is not if you get a little scratch on your car, you're going to get it fixed. It's because if you get into a car accident and your car gets totaled, you're covered.
So you're in the we don't insure for oil changes.
We don't, and we shouldn't. And that's not the structure of auto insurance. So health insurance is different. Health insurance is prepaid health care.
Yeah.
It is you get your prescription drugs covered, you get your preventive care covered. Now, we may want that, and there's a good policy reason to say our healthcare system is accessed through health insurance, and therefore we want widespread health insurance. I am perfectly fine with that conclusion. The challenge, though, for our health system is if we are focused so much on how to have more and more generous health insurance policies, that's only going to mean that our health costs are going to rise over time, and we're not addressing the fundamental concerns of the healthcare economy and how to get healthcare costs under control. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, even though it's called the Affordable Care Act, it didn't really do that and doesn't have the right incentives to do that in the long run. There are some things in the bill that are positive developments. Paying for value as opposed to volume in healthcare is a good thing overall. However, when you structure health insurance plans to become more and more generous over time, as the ACA did, you create some real problems in terms of what's happening with the cost curve going forward in healthcare. And so I firmly believe we need to address costs, and Obamacare did not do it in the right way.
I mean, it's such an interesting point, I guess, going back to first principles, because I think so much about the idea of competitive bargaining of prices between goods that we take in every other part of our lives, and certainly in healthcare in other parts of the world where it's not uncommon that you would go to a surgeon and say, how much is this procedure? And, cost compare that to another surgeon. But I just don't know how you push the reset button on this so that you can actually get to that state in the U.S.
Well, it would be possible, and I think you're starting to see some of this. Private sector employers through their health plans are beginning to provide more information about the quality of care that's provided, and they're trying to be a little bit more transparent around cost, although not nearly enough. You're right. I think in other countries, one country that's got a very high-performing health system is Singapore. Yeah. And they consume about 4% of their economy on healthcare. And one of the things in Singapore is how much something's going to cost before you do it. So you're going to have an appendectomy. They will tell you, look, for these various kinds of arrangements, if you want to share a hospital room with 6 other people, here's how much it'll cost. If you want your private room with your TV and your cable and your gourmet food, here's how much it's going to cost. That kind of transparency we need more of in this country, because at the end of the day, that's really what's going to affect our ability to control cost.
Yeah, fascinating. And I mean, I guess the idea of moving towards more catastrophic insurance with healthcare savings plans is an idea. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it's something that's gotten traction in the U.S.
Yeah, I think on the private sector side, again, with employers, more and more employers are offering these kinds of arrangements, which are essentially catastrophic insurance plans coupled with health savings accounts. So you get to save your own money for healthcare in a tax-preferred way. And by contrast, you're much more price sensitive because you're responsible up to a relatively higher deductible. And that constrains health spending. There's no question about it. Now, those arrangements are not going to be for every family at this point, because not every family is going to be in a financial position to do that. But over time, if we begin to migrate our healthcare system toward those kinds of policies and orient government policy towards subsidizing care in the right way, so not subsidizing overconsumption, but subsidizing necessary consumption, then I think you're going to see impacts on overall health spending. But we're only very early on in our development as a healthcare system toward one that has greater transparency and greater consumer involvement around the cost of healthcare.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I wanted to touch on just immigration quickly. You mentioned it in the run-up, and that I guess the administration botched the first travel ban, if you like, and that they did better the second time around. I mean, the second one is still not in effect due to a federal court ruling,
right,
as far as I understand. And I guess one of the things that people are focused on, or I think about a lot, is if you want to do skilled immigration reform, if you want to do illegal immigration reform and a bunch of these things, are we not focused on the wrong things on immigration at the moment?
Yeah, I think you're right. The key to – if you see immigration as an economic issue, which I fundamentally do, The question becomes, how do we create an immigration policy that allows us as a country to orient toward growth and increases in productivity? Because ultimately that is what is going to drive the growth of our economy going forward. And high-skill immigration, ensuring that we have an immigration system that's helping us fill a supply of labor, whether it's on the high end or on the low end. I think these are the kinds of policy questions that desperately need to be addressed. I think, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, we are very much focused on the questions of border enforcement and what to do with the people who are here illegally, the 12 million or so people who are here illegally. At the end of the day, those are relatively minor problems when you think about the broader issues we have in an immigration system where we don't have an immigration system fundamentally in this country that promotes merit, that promotes people staying in this country who can contribute to our economy. We need to begin to orient our system, our immigration policies and systems toward ensuring that we have the right human capital in this country to grow our economy and create jobs. Is border enforcement important? Sure it is. But that's a relatively easy solution, right? We either enforce the laws or we don't. But so much political attention is paid to those hot-button issues that it really takes us away from the fundamental questions we need to be asking about immigration to this country.
And then I guess as a follow-up to that, I wonder about the nationalist rhetoric around immigration reform. Because if you take something like the H-1B program as an example and you say we want to revamp skilled immigration because not enough skilled people are getting in, and it's being abused by certain firms. It just feels like that would be an easier thing to sell than America first or Americans first, and that kind of thing. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that the populist element here in the U.S., I don't even know if you want to call it populist, nationalists may be more appropriate. Yeah. I think that's been bubbling up for a while. Right. And I think all of these issues, trade, immigration, they're all wrapped up in people's sense of what is America today and what did they think it was going to be. And for a lot of Americans, they're seeing things that are unfamiliar, or they're seeing people that look unfamiliar, or they're experiencing things in their own careers and jobs and lives that are unfamiliar. And they're looking for the easy answer. And the easy answer may be a more restrictionist immigration policy, a more mercantilist trade policy. But at the end of the day, making the case for why we need policies oriented toward growth, why we need policies oriented toward creating a more broad-based economy. These are very difficult arguments to make, and they take leadership. And so in the absence of that leadership, whether from the president or from Congress, it's going to be very difficult to fight against this sort of nationalist overtone we've had in our public policy debates, and frankly in our politics now for these last several years. And I'm concerned about whether we're going to be able to get to the right answers if we continue to get so stuck in the political paradigm we seem to be stuck in now.
Yeah, and also the president is certainly not shying away from it. He may be the banner bearer of the nationalist movement in the U.S. at the moment.
Yeah, to be fair, though, I think he kind of came along at a point when the movement had a certain level of strength and maturity already. I think he gave voice to a lot of this. And I don't think that one can blame the president politically for wanting to take advantage of that. Now, obviously, leadership is about making hard choices, and I'm hopeful, I hope, that the president will see going forward that the right policies, the ones that will grow the U.S. economy, that will create more broad-based success in this country, that those policies are ones that may require him to abandon some of the more nativist elements of the campaign rhetoric and policy that we've seen, certainly on the campaign trail, and maybe even to a certain degree in the administration so far.
Right. This really strikes at the heart of something I wanted to ask you about. It seemed, you're obviously a Republican and a conservative. How do you feel about the party at the moment? Do you feel like the populism and nationalism and the Trumpianism will move more towards the conservative heart of the party, or do you feel like it's moving the other way? And I guess where do you go as a fiscally conservative person, or just a conservative more broadly in the United States at the moment, who doesn't identify necessarily with some of the populist rhetoric?
To a certain degree, I think that this clash within the conservative movement has been coming for a while.
Right.
And you see it played out across a number of different policy areas. I mean, tax policy is one example of kind of a wonky way in which it plays out, where you have some arguing we need reductions in tax rates regardless of the deficit implications. And you've got others who say, look, we've got to be very cognizant of yes, a tax cut will help the economy in a lot of ways, but it's probably not going to pay for itself entirely, particularly if you're taking a corporate rate, for example, from 35% down to 15%. So this fight within conservatism between what I would call a more mainstream, practical, solutions-oriented conservatism and one that I think is probably, I would characterize as slightly more strident, but sincerely held, just strident. I think that this challenge is one that conservatism has needed to face head-on for a while. So in some ways, I'm kind of glad we're having this discussion now.
But it's not always only the difference between strident or pragmatism is the way you're framing it. I mean, sometimes it's diametrically opposed.
You're right.
So if you take like the $1 trillion infrastructure with whether that comes or not, you compare that to fiscal conservative Republicans, they're on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and so to a certain degree, we're going to see how this plays out politically over these next several months and years. I mean, one of the big questions I always had is what's going to happen the first time that President Trump proposes something that a majority of Republicans don't really care for. Now, you could argue healthcare was that first thing, although they ended up getting on the same page. But certainly infrastructure is an area where you can imagine there being more Democrats for it than Republicans, particularly if the goal is to deficit finance an infrastructure package. You're right. I think there are diametric oppositions, and to a certain degree, these are going to get worked out by the political process. The president's either going to have his way, or Republicans, mainstream Republicans in Congress are going to have their way when it comes to something like infrastructure. So we'll really have to see. I don't have an easy answer for where it goes. All I would say is that there is an intellectual vibrancy, I do think, in the conservative movement right now, where we are having very lively disagreements with one another over a number of these different policy areas in a way that I don't see on the left. I think the left in some ways is devoid of this level of intellectual curiosity right now. I think the left has really moved toward the fringes of progressivism, and that's become acceptable. The notion, for example, that you ought to have free college. This is something that's become relatively common orthodoxy amongst people on the left. Well, it wasn't that long ago that stricture, that formulation, was pretty far on the progressive left. But you've got people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders that have made it acceptable to have a relatively far left set of orthodoxies now. And there's no questioning of that on the left. There's no questioning that, of course, you must raise the minimum wage. Of course, you must have policies that fundamentally constrain the role of fundamentally constrain, businesses at the expense of bigger government. So at the very least, say what you will about what's happening in the conservative movement right now. At the very least, we're having a debate and there is an active discussion happening. I just don't see it on the left.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I suppose maybe that's really frustrating because there's never been a better time to have it. I mean, if you was someone that was interested in free trade and you happen to be a Democrat, now would be the time to pounce on the idea of economic growth and free trade.
Well, and to be fair, it's not all Democrats. I think that there are some who are trying to be more thoughtful about it. But
I was just trying to trick you to see if I could get you to defend the Democrats.
No, look, there are many thoughtful Democrats out there. I think that the throw weight of the Democratic Party right now is the far progressive left.
Yeah. I think it's a natural response to wanting to just balance the seesaw. You just run out to the end of the seesaw to see if you can bring some balance back.
And they've been the most visceral in opposing the president, right? Yeah. And I think it is natural for opposition movements to fall into the category of wanting to socialize around people who are most strident in their opposition.
I think – okay, so I just want to ask you one final question about this. There was a lot of talk about this idea of the world – catching this populism and this nationalism that was spreading out from the United States, Le Pen and in Germany and a bunch of different places. With the current French election and Le Pen losing, Macron winning there, do you think that maybe the tide has turned on that? I mean, it's a really early indicator and we don't really know, but do you think there is a sense that maybe this is just something that will remain isolated to the U.S., or do you think it's something that's spread more internationally as well?
I think that every country is unique. I hesitate to say that the victory of Macron in France really signifies end of the trend, if you will. I think that there is still a very strong element. I mean, 35% voting for Le Pen is no small number. I mean, of course, the election wasn't close, but 35% is a significant number of people. Yeah. And the notion of there being an anti-globalism or nativism is something that I think has always existed to a certain degree, but that has been given voice not just in the U.S., but in Europe. The fact that Trump was victorious in the U.S., whereas these other leaders were not or have not been thus far, does not suggest to me that it's a set of consequences that's only felt in the U.S. What I would say is I think American politics is very different from the politics of these other countries. And the ability of Donald Trump as a unique talent to communicate a message, to connect with people, and to really break all the rules of conventional campaigning and politics, that factor should not be understated. It cannot be overstated, excuse me. And, with all due respect to Le Pen or to other of these candidates, I don't know that any of them has a level of skill that Donald Trump did. So I think that the Trump phenomenon is unique. But the notion that because you have a candidate that embraced this kind of nationalism in France who lost then means that the whole thing is over. I don't know that I think that view is a little bit simple and a little bit probably not consistent with the reality of where we are right now.
Yeah, I think the one thing going into next year's elections and the elections in 2 years' time is if the Republican Party doesn't, I guess, cohere around something, I think there will be a price to pay potentially at election time.
Yeah, I mean, the midterm election in 2018 will largely be a referendum on the president. It traditionally is. And the president traditionally doesn't do well, by the way, not just this president, but every president historically has not usually done well in their first midterm election. For the Republicans, that will be most acute in terms of looking at what happens in the U.S. House. I think the Senate dynamic is different because the map is very favorable for Republicans in 2018. I think it would have to take a number of very bad developments for the Republicans to lose the Senate. I think that the House is much more perilous in a lot of ways. But fundamentally, look, Republicans have to stand for something. And the question is going to be right now so far, it seems to me, what do all Republicans agree on? They seem to agree that Neil Gorsuch was a good thing. They seem to agree that the U.S. should be supportive of allies who are supportive of us, and Israel is a primary example of that, I think, for many Americans. And Republicans in general don't like the administrative state, right? Is that enough to be a governing agenda? I don't know. It seems a little thin to me. And so you're right in the sense I think Republicans are going to need to find themselves again. But I feel much more comfortable about where the conservative movement is today than where the opposition, where the progressive movement is, for many of the reasons I've talked about already. But I would hope that Republicans can start to cohere a little bit more around, here's some things that we really want to get done, and try to bring together these elements of populism with these elements of more mainstream conservatism and figure out if there is a middle way. Now, in some cases, they will be opposed, but I think there are a number of areas for compromise.
Lanhee Chen, thank you very much for coming on Blind Spot.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.